I live on a small farm in the northern reaches of Montana, where the wilderness stretches endlessly, blending into the horizon. Here, life follows a rhythm dictated by the seasons, the weather, and the land itself. It's a peaceful, quiet existence, far removed from the noise of city life. Spring was supposed to bring new life and warmer days, but this year, the cold lingered longer than usual. The snow had only recently started to melt, revealing patches of frost-bitten grass and soil that seemed reluctant to wake up from winter's grip. Animals, both wild and domestic, were struggling to adjust. Deer ventured closer to human homes, searching for food, and I often spotted coyotes in the distance, prowling the edges of my fields. My name is Jack Miller. I grew up in these parts, learning to respect the land and the creatures that call it home. As a farmer, I've always worked with nature, not against it. Over the years, I've helped stray dogs, rescued trapped birds, and even left food out for hungry deer during particularly harsh winters. But nothing could have prepared me for the encounter that would change my life. It was early morning when it happened. The sun was barely rising, casting a pale orange glow across the snow-dusted fields. I had just finished feeding the chickens when I noticed something strange. My dogs, usually calm and sleepy at this hour, were barking wildly. They stood at the edge of the property, facing the forest, their ears pinned back and their tails rigid. Curious and a little uneasy, I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the tree line. At first, I thought it was a fallen log or maybe a large rock half buried in the snow, but then it moved. My breath caught as I realized what I was looking at. A bear. A massive, dark figure swayed unsteadily near the forest's edge. From this distance, I could see its ribs outlined beneath its fur, its frame gaunt and fragile. This was no ordinary bear, it was starving. I had seen bears before, of course. Living out here, it was almost a rite of passage to encounter one from time to time. But this was different. Bears were supposed to be strong, powerful, and self-reliant, yet this one looked broken, as if it had been fighting for its life and losing. I stood, frozen, unsure of what to do. The bear took a shaky step forward, then another, before collapsing into the snow. It lay there, motionless, and for a moment I thought it was dead, but then its head lifted weakly and its eyes locked onto mine. Even from a distance, I could see something in its gaze, a mix of desperation and exhaustion. It wasn't the wild, unpredictable look of a predator. It was pleading, almost human, as if it understood that I was its only chance. My heart pounded in my chest as I weighed my options. Every survival rule I'd ever learned screamed at me to stay away. A bear, especially one in this state, was unpredictable and dangerous. But I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. This animal wasn't a threat. It was a creature on the brink of death, clinging to the last shred of hope. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. I remembered a bag of old dog food sitting in the barn, something I'd been meaning to throw out. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to help the bear regain some strength. Gripping the binoculars tightly, I turned and headed toward the barn, my thoughts a whirlwind of fear and determination. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. This wasn't just a bear. It was a life worth saving. As I prepared to return to the forest with the food, I glanced back at the dogs, who had stopped barking but remained tense. They seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, their eyes following me as I stepped toward the unknown. Little did I know, that single moment of hesitation at the tree line would mark the beginning of an extraordinary journey, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about nature, fear, and the fragile bond between man and beast. As I stood there with the bag of old dog food slung over my shoulder, I could feel the weight of my decision settling on me. Every instinct screamed that this was a terrible idea. Getting close to a wild bear, even one so weak, could end in disaster. And yet, something about the way it had looked at me, desperate, exhausted, almost pleading, had stirred something deep inside. I made my way back toward the edge of the forest, the crisp morning air biting at my face. The bear hadn't moved much since I'd last seen it. It was still lying in the snow, its head resting on its front paws. The sight made my stomach churn. This wasn't how such a majestic creature was supposed to look. Stopping a safe distance away, I knelt and carefully poured some of the food onto the snow. My hands were trembling as I opened the bag, half from the cold and half from fear. I didn't know how the bear would react. Would it see me as a threat? Would it muster the last of its strength to charge at me? I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on the animal. The bear lifted its head, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the food. For a long moment, it didn't move, and I wondered if it was even strong enough to eat. Then, with visible effort, it pushed itself up onto its front legs and began to crawl toward the pile. I held my breath as it reached the food. The bear sniffed at it cautiously before taking a small bite. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was saving what little energy it had left. I could see its ribs rising and falling with every labored breath. I stayed where I was, kneeling in the snow, ready to run if the bear decided to turn its attention toward me. But it didn't. It ate slowly, pausing every few bites to rest its head on the ground. It was a pitiful sight, but also strangely beautiful. Here was a creature that had every reason to give up, and yet it was still fighting. After a few minutes, the bear stopped eating and looked up at me. Its amber eyes seemed softer now, less wild. I couldn't believe it. It was as if it understood that I was trying to help. I didn't move, afraid to break the fragile trust that seemed to be forming. The bear lowered its head back to the snow and closed its eyes, its body rising and falling in deep, uneven breaths. It was too weak to do much more than rest. For a while, I just sat there, watching the bear and listening to the silence of the forest. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the snow. I knew I couldn't stay there all day, but I couldn't just leave the bear to its fate either. Finally, I stood and began walking back toward the barn. I didn't look back, but I could feel the bear's eyes on me as I disappeared into the trees. Back at the farm, I grabbed a few more supplies, a bucket of water, some more food, and a blanket. I didn't know if a bear would accept a blanket, but it was worth a try. I also grabbed my old first aid kit, though I wasn't sure how I'd use it on an animal like this. When I returned to the edge of the forest, the bear was still there, curled up in the snow. It lifted its head weakly as I approached, but this time there was no fear in its eyes. I set the water and food down a few feet away, then slowly spread the blanket over the snow nearby. I sat down again, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The bear sniffed at the new pile of food before taking another bite. It seemed a little stronger now, though its movements were still sluggish. As the morning stretched into afternoon, I stayed with the bear, making sure it had enough to eat and drink. At one point, it raised its head and let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something softer, almost like a sigh. I didn't know if it was gratitude, exhaustion, or something else entirely, but it made me feel like I'd made the right choice. For the first time that day, I felt a flicker of hope. This was just the beginning, but it was enough. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't give up on this bear. The next few days were a delicate balance of hope and uncertainty. Each morning, I'd return to the edge of the forest with food and water, unsure if the bear would still be there. But every time I found it waiting, not standing, but sitting upright, watching the tree line as if expecting me. The bear was gaining strength, though slowly. Its once-labored breaths were now deeper and steadier, and it had started moving with a bit more confidence. Yet the cub-like vulnerability lingered in its eyes, and I felt a growing responsibility to see this through. Each visit, I tried to close the distance between us by a few steps. The first time I sat closer, the bear froze. Its gaze locked on me, its massive body tense. My heart raced, but I stayed still, speaking softly to reassure it. After a long moment, it relaxed and continued eating, its trust inching forward as steadily as its recovery. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. I arrived with a bucket of water and a fresh blanket, but instead of waiting at the usual spot, the bear had moved closer to my farm. It sat near the boundary of my field, its amber eyes following my every step. It felt like an unspoken agreement was forming, a truce built on mutual understanding. I placed the food down carefully and sat nearby, the space between us shrinking with each encounter. The bear began exhibiting behaviors that astonished me. It no longer lunged at the food with desperation. Instead, it ate slowly, often pausing to look at me as if studying my intentions. One time, it even nudged the bucket of water closer to me, a gesture I couldn't explain but left me stunned. Each evening, I returned to the cabin, physically drained but emotionally full. My connection with the bear had grown into something I hadn't anticipated, a bond built not just on survival, but on trust and a fragile kind of companionship. I didn't know how long the bear would stay, but I knew that, for now, it wasn't just surviving, it was healing. And somehow, so was I. The bear's progress was undeniable. It had regained much of its strength, and its once sluggish movements were now purposeful and steady. But with this recovery came a new challenge. The closer we grew, the more I questioned how far I could push this fragile relationship before instinct, hers or mine, took over. One morning, I stepped outside to find the bear no longer waiting at the edge of the forest. Panic flared briefly before I spotted it near my barn, sniffing at the old wooden beams. Its boldness startled me. For days, it had kept a careful distance, but now it was venturing into my territory. I approached cautiously, carrying the usual supplies. The bear turned as I drew near, its amber eyes locking onto mine. My heart raced as I stopped just a few feet away, closer than I'd ever dared before. The air felt electric, like the moment before a storm. Would it trust me, or would it see me as a threat? I set the food down slowly, keeping my movements deliberate. The bear hesitated, then took a step forward, its massive paws crunching softly in the snow. It reached the food and began eating, but this time it didn't look away from me. I could feel its gaze, unblinking and intense, as if testing the limits of our bond. Later that day, something happened that tested that bond further. I was checking the barn when I heard the dogs barking furiously. Rushing outside, I saw a second bear, a younger, leaner one, approaching from the forest. It stopped a few yards away from the larger bear, growling low and menacing. The larger bear turned and let out a deep, rumbling sound, a clear warning. For a moment, the two stared each other down, the tension thick in the freezing air. I stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let nature take its course. But then, to my astonishment, the larger bear turned toward me and took a step back, almost as if positioning itself between me and the intruder. The younger bear growled again, but eventually retreated into the trees, its silhouette vanishing into the shadows. I realized then how far we'd come. This bear, once starving and terrified, had not only begun to trust me, but was now protecting me in its own way. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the bear returned to the edge of the forest. It didn't venture closer to the cabin again that day, but its actions left me shaken, in a good way. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The question now was whether I could prepare it for the day it would leave for good. The days passed, and the bear grew stronger with each visit. It no longer moved with the cautious fragility that had defined its earlier days. Its coat, once ragged and dull, now had a healthy sheen. The cub-like vulnerability in its amber eyes had been replaced with something I hadn't seen before: confidence. But with that recovery came an unspoken reality. I couldn't keep this bear here forever. Each step it took closer to my home blurred the line between wild and tame, and I knew that the longer it stayed, the harder it would be for it to return to the wilderness. The turning point came on a cold, clear morning. I found the bear standing near the barn again, its powerful frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Its movements were deliberate, almost restless, and I could feel the shift in its demeanor. It was time. I packed a small sled with the last of the food I had been setting out for the bear, along with a bundle of warm blankets. My plan was simple: lead it deep into the forest, far enough from the farm that it could find its way back to the life it was meant to have. The bear followed me willingly as I pulled the sled along the familiar path toward the woods. Its trust in me was clear, but it also made this moment bittersweet. With every step, I felt the weight of the bond we had formed, knowing that it was about to be tested one final time. We reached a clearing far from the farm, a spot where the trees opened up to reveal a sunlit patch of untouched snow. I stopped and turned to face the bear, who paused just a few steps behind me. Its eyes met mine, and for a moment the forest felt completely still. I unpacked the sled, laying out the food and blankets in the center of the clearing. The bear watched intently, its head tilted slightly as if trying to understand my actions. When I stepped back, it approached the pile cautiously, sniffing at the food before settling down beside it. For a long time, I stood there, watching it eat. Part of me wanted to stay, to see it through to the end, but I knew that lingering would only make the goodbye harder. I took a step back, then another, the snow crunching softly under my boots. The bear raised its head, watching me as I retreated toward the tree line. Its amber eyes were calm, almost reflective, and I could feel the silent understanding between us. Just as I reached the edge of the clearing, the bear did something I'll never forget. It stood up, shook the snow from its coat, and let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl, but something gentler, almost like a farewell. I turned and walked back toward the farm, the weight of the moment settling over me like the cold air. I didn't look back, but I could feel the bear's presence fading into the forest, its place in my life now a memory. By the time I returned home, the sun was high in the sky, and the familiar sounds of the farm greeted me. The bear was gone, but its impact remained. It had tested my courage, my compassion, and my understanding of what it meant to share this world with the wild. And as I stood at the edge of the field, staring into the vast expanse of trees, I realized something profound. I had helped save the bear's life, but in many ways, it had saved mine too. The days after the bear's departure felt strangely quiet. The familiar rhythm of farm life returned, but something felt missing. I'd grown used to its presence, the sound of its heavy steps in the snow, the quiet way it observed me, the unspoken trust we had built. Now, the silence of the forest felt like an echo of that connection, a reminder that the bear was gone. Still, I took comfort in knowing it was where it belonged. Deep in the wilderness, it would find its own way, no longer tethered to the fragile safety I had provided. Every morning, I'd glance toward the forest, half hoping to see its dark silhouette among the trees, but it never returned. As the days stretched into weeks, I noticed subtle signs of its presence: faint tracks in the snow near the stream, a broken branch here or there. They were fleeting reminders, but they reassured me that the bear was surviving, adapting to the life it was meant to lead. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a fiery orange, I heard a sound that made me pause. It was distant but unmistakable, the deep, resonant call of a bear. It wasn't a cry of distress, nor was it a warning. It was calm, almost content, carrying through the cold air like a message from the wild. I stepped out onto the porch, the chill biting at my skin. For a moment, I stood there, listening, letting the sound wash over me. I couldn't be sure it was the same bear, but in my heart I believed it was. It felt like a final farewell, a reassurance that it was thriving and free. Inside the cabin, the photos on the walls took on a new meaning. Where once they had been trophies of my work, they now felt like windows into the wild world I'd shared with the bear. Each image reminded me of the quiet strength of nature, its resilience, and the fragile balance that binds us to it. I realized how much the experience had changed me. I no longer viewed the wilderness as something separate, something to be observed from a distance. I had been part of it, however briefly, and it had left its mark on me. That night, as I stoked the fire and settled into my chair, I felt a sense of peace. The bear's journey had become a part of mine, and though it was gone, the bond we had formed would stay with me forever. It wasn't just a story about survival. It was a story about connection, about stepping beyond fear and instinct to find something deeper. And as the fire crackled softly, I made a quiet promise to myself to live with that same trust and respect for the wild, to honor the lesson the bear had taught me. The wilderness was vast and unpredictable, but in its heart was a beauty that I now understood in a way I never had before. The bear's return to the wild wasn't an ending. It was a beginning for both of us. Weeks have passed since the bear returned to the wild, yet its presence lingers in my thoughts. Every trip to the forest, every quiet moment on the farm, reminds me of the bond we formed. I often catch myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see its familiar silhouette, but all that greets me now is the stillness of the woods. The experience changed me in ways I didn't expect. I no longer see the wilderness as something distant, something to be admired from the outside. It's alive, interconnected, and I've been a part of it, if only for a short time. The bear taught me about trust, patience, and the fragility of life. It reminded me that even the wildest creatures can show vulnerability, and that sometimes a small act of kindness can ripple into something extraordinary. As I stand at the edge of the forest, I smile. The bear is gone, but the lessons remain, and for that, I will always be grateful. This story reminds us of the deep connection we share with the natural world, a bond that's too often forgotten in our busy lives. The bear came to me in a moment of desperation, and together we bridged the gap between fear and trust, showing that kindness can transcend even the wildest of boundaries. Let this be a reminder that every small act of compassion matters, whether it's helping a creature in need or protecting the wilderness they call home. The world is full of moments like these, moments where humanity and nature intersect in extraordinary ways. If this story moved you, I invite you to join me in exploring more tales of courage, kindness, and the fragile beauty of life in the wild. Subscribe to the channel and together we can continue to honor and protect the incredible world we all share. Thank you for watching.